right, so this is a flip lecture to conclude. Okay, yes, so this lecture is going to be about homeostasis, obviously you can see in this slide. And what we need to understand about homeostasis is that even though the external environment changes, the internal environment doesn't. So the external environment has an impact or a stimulus on the internal environment, let's say of a cell, and the cell will try its best to use all the organelles within the cell to maintain homeostasis. And so again, remember, homeostasis is a constant internal condition. So the response alters the internal conditions a little bit based on the stimulus. So for example, with our lab that we did with physical activity and heart rate, obviously the conditions that we put our body under with the physical activity had an impact on our internal homeostasis by increasing our heart rate, and we measured that and we got data on that. So we've got like before exercise data, we have during exercise data, and then after. And what you should have concluded from that is that that was a perfect example of homeostasis, because there was your normal range and then there was a stimulus of physical activity that raised your heart rate, and then after physical activity you had some rest. 15 minutes later it returned back to the normal state. So this returning back to the normal state is again an example of homeostasis. Another example of homeostasis is when we did the food lab with the pH and food types. And one of the things you should have recognized about the buffer solution, which is really acting like what a living thing is like, what you should have noticed is that that didn't change much, even though the external environment of adding HCl, which was our acid, and adding NaOH, which was our sodium hydroxide alkaline substance, even adding those things to the buffer did not change the buffer at all. The buffer remained pretty stable as far as pH. Now, some things of why it's important. It's really important because homeostasis helps to keep internal conditions within a certain range. Okay, there's a range of tolerance that we have as humans functioning as a living system for pH, for example. There's a range of temperatures that we function best at. Cells can only function in narrow ranges, otherwise you'll have cell death. For blood pH, if there's anything less than a 6.9 for blood pH, then you'll have a result of that is cell death. So it pretty much places these living things, living systems in or outside their range of tolerance. So as I'm going through these slides, you should probably be writing down what's on the slides, but also what I'm writing down on these with my wonderful handwriting that you see. So a little bit of both is what you should be writing down. So we have situations where environments change, and they could subject us to tolerance ranges that fall outside our range. So if this was the y-axis, this is the x-axis, and let's say the y-axis is temperature, and then this is temperature, our activity level. Okay. As activity level increases, so let's say this is high activity level, this is low activity level. As our activity level increases, meaning physical activity, our temperature increases. But we get to a point where our body helps to bring this back down to our normal range of temperature, and those inputs that help to maintain that homeostasis are things like sweating, an increase in heart rate, which increases blood flow to the surface of the skin. That's one of the reasons why you turn like a deeper color of red, even with any skin tone, that can happen. And that's because there's more blood flow to the surface of the skin, which then allows for more cooling of the skin to bring your body temperature back down, as we can see right here. So that is outside our range of tolerance, that temperature. So as a result, our body strives to maintain and bring it back down to the normal range. Some situations, those would not allow for that to come back down, and so then that would be the end result, as you can see on the slide, would be death. So what I would like you to do right now is take out your little sheets, these laminated cards that we've made as a biology department, and I want you to go over the negative feedback mechanism one. I want you to go over the oven one together, and then the swimming pool one on your own, okay? And so that's what you're going to be doing in class, and we'll probably just do that right away when you get into class, actually, to help us get ready for the rest of it. So as we, after we go through those things, you're going to notice that there's a type of regulation or negative feedback that happens to regulate body temperature. So if we look here, there's a stimulus, and the stimulus is the body temperature rises above 99 degrees Fahrenheit. The receptor is the body's temperature sensors, and that sends information to our control center, and our control center is our brain. And then our brain sends the effector, it sends messages or commands, and that is the effector. And so the effector are the actual things that happen as a result of the control center receiving this information. And the effector could be the blood vessels and sweat glands in the skin start to regulate or push more blood through. Glands in the skin open up, and then that leads to a response. And your response is an increased blood flow to the skin that increases sweating, and it pretty much, the stimulus then is kind of held back down, and homeostasis is restored. So what we're looking at here is a negative feedback where you have a change in one direction, but then as a result of homeostatic mechanisms, including our control center of our brain, that change in one direction is reversed back to the beginning, back to homeostasis. Okay, so that is a negative feedback. The key terms that we need to know about this negative feedback are things like set point and really what negative feedback is. So negative feedback, as you can see on this slide, is a regulatory mechanism in which a stimulus causes an opposite output in order to maintain homeostasis. So you basically, again, with an arrow, have a change or a stimulus in one direction, and that causes a output in the opposite direction so that homeostasis could be maintained. Set point is the normal level or point at which a variable tends to stabilize. So things like body temperature and pH all have like an ideal point at which they are most stable. Okay, and then let's move on here. Some other key terms. The receptor, again, is the structure that detects the change. So if we go back to this, the receptor here is the body, the actual structure that senses the change. So there's obviously then a change in body temperature, and so then that receptor change sends messages to the brain to detect this change, and as a result then messages are sent via the blood vessels, and that monitors then that temperature, or in this case the pH. So the receptor is the actual structure that detects the change. The control center, again, determines the response and course of action based on what message it gets. So again, our control center is the brain. And then the effector are the muscles, organs, or any other structures that actually receive signals from the brain then responds in order to correct the change. Okay, so we basically, again, if we were to go back to this slide, you have a stimulus, right, which then sends messages to, it's basically the input of the external environment on the receptor. The receptor receives that information and sends that message to the brain, which is the control center, and then the control center sends messages to the effector, which then provides the response. Again, this is all for homeostasis. This is the negative feedback that happens to maintain homeostasis in a human being. The Bozeman video we actually already watched the other day when he was talking about negative feedback, so we don't need to watch that again. And what we're going to do then at the conclusion of this activity is finish it and then answer the post-assessment questions that are posed on the activity. If we were to look at another example of a negative feedback with blood, we look at sugar. So here we have normal blood glucose levels, and that tells there's also high blood glucose levels, and so that is the change. And so then the pancreas is like, whoa, there's too much glucose in the blood. And so then as a result, the insulin is released from the pancreas to reduce the blood glucose levels, and that returns it back to a normal blood glucose level state. Then that sends the message back to the pancreas that it doesn't need to make any more insulin. Okay, so what I want you to get out of this is that we always return back to normal. When everything is functioning, if there's a change in one direction, it'll return back to normal, thankfully, right? So we don't have any abnormalities. But of course, we're going to learn over the course of this year that there are many different types of diseases and abnormalities that people have to deal with on a daily basis. And they have to be subsidized through medicine to accommodate for any of these changes, okay? So again, this is just another example of a change in one direction, too high of blood glucose levels. That message is sent to the command center of the brain. The brain sends the message to the pancreas. The pancreas produces insulin, and then the insulin and the glucose levels are restored, and then that message is sent back to the pancreas that it's all good and ready to be done, okay? So let's bring it back to pH and buffers. The proper pH balance is important because different chemical and metabolic processes work best under specific pH conditions. What I want you to know about pH is it really determines the chemical climate in a living thing. If the pH is off, then it honestly affects everything else. But what we will also find is that there's different pH requirements for different parts of the human organism. So for example, for digestion to occur in a human organism, the pH needs to be pretty low, at or around 2. But then other parts of our body, like our circulatory system, the blood needs to be neutral, right around 7.2 to 7.4. And then every tissue in our body has a characteristic pH. So there's a lot of things that the human body has to control in order to maintain homeostasis. I want to say it's chaotic, but it's actually organized chaos. And the command center, our brain, is completely responsible for how to deal with those changes. Now, we naturally, as a living thing, have things called buffers. And a buffer is something that helps to maintain the pH within a range of pH level that are suitable. These buffers that we have are formed to absorb excess hydrogen ions that we find in our blood or hydroxide ions that we find in our blood. And so when there's too much of these, then things called buffers will eat them up. Okay? And a buffer is a type of chemical. This has the effect of protecting the original solution from the changes, and then if there's a small amount added or taken away, then it'll make do. Pure water actually doesn't have any buffer, so you should have noticed in your pH lab that when you added HCl or NaOH, that the water definitely showed those changes. So it doesn't have any natural buffers. So when these hydrogen ions were released into the water, or when the hydroxide ions were released into the water, then you definitely saw a change in the solution of it being more acidic or more basic. Okay, so another thing I want to add to this is that ecosystems actually have a natural buffering capability. And one of the ecosystems I'd like to talk about is a lake, okay, a freshwater lake. And a freshwater lake, if we were to draw this, and we'll put a little boat in here. Let's say this freshwater lake has bedrock in it, and this bedrock is basically calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is also called limestone. And this actually acts like a natural buffer. So if there were pH changes in this lake to where maybe it was too acidic, because of the lake's natural design of having limestone as the bedrock, it will actually buffer the effect of that pH change. So it kind of acts as its own organism in buffering that pH. One of the biggest problems environmentally is air pollution. And with air pollution comes a byproduct of it called acid rain. That's my dog, sorry. And acid rain is formed from sulfuric oxides, which come from the burning of coal. We just put an X here because it could be 3, it could be 4 sulfates. When that mixes with water vapor, which is, up in the sky in the atmosphere, that actually makes sulfuric acid, H2SO4. And sulfuric acid is basically acid rain. So when that acid rain goes into this lake, it can cause devastation to the organisms that live in it if the acid rain is very acidic and if the lake doesn't have natural buffering capability. In this case, though, with this particular example of a lake, it has a limestone buffering capability, so therefore the effects of that pH change won't be as great as if it didn't have limestone buffering. So I just wanted to give you that as an example of an ecosystem that has natural buffering capability, in addition to living things within the ecosystem that have that natural buffering capability. Okay, that's it. So make sure that you have these notes from these slides in your notes, and also my additional notes that I have written here so neatly. Okay, that's it. Goodbye.